I know there's a lot of people on here really excited about this topic. It's a big topic, so.
It is. I'm excited to be here. So hi, everyone. Yeah, as Gregory said, I'm Melissa Coates, and I actually just finished my first year of being self-employed. At the moment, I'm spending most of my time in the area of like Power BI governance, administration, that kind of stuff. But my background is primarily, you know, data warehousing, BI, that sort of thing. So this is one of those topics that I really like because over the years I've done both IT jobs and I've done kind of in my former lifetime when I was an accountant, right, been the proverbial power user. So a lot of these kind of topics I have so much fun with. So what I want to accomplish for this session is mainly three things. Where I want to start is talking to you about how, when I say the Power BI administrator role, it's not going to be the same thing for really any of you on the call. And I'll explain why here in a few minutes. And then I really just want to introduce the breadth and scope of the kinds of things that you might be focusing on. And then where we're going to conclude is just with a few recommendations for do this next if you're in, you know, this particular state. So here's the path we're going to go on. We've got about an hour and a half. So, you know, as you could guess, we're not going to go deep into any of them. So it's more of just an introduction to the things that you want to focus on and be aware of, or maybe go and learn more about, that sort of thing. The slides for this presentation, here's where you can find them on my website. There's a PDF of these slides that you can download right now. And there's a diagram that you're going to see in just a minute that if you want a copy of that, you can download that as well. I need to update it here with some very recent changes, which I'll get to that in the next few weeks as well. So during the course of this section, I'm going to have a handful of questions that I want to ask you, and so there's basically two ways you can participate. Most of you are going to just use choice one, which is the web browser, and that URL right in the middle there, the polev.com with the mcoats 224. If you want to pop open a web browser and go to that URL, we actually can start with the first question. And if you didn't get that URL, don't worry, it's at the top of this page right here.
And I just shared it too. All the links have been shared in the chat.
Sweet. Thank you, sir. So yeah, I just kind of want to know, you know, where Power BI admin falls. Ooh, a full timer. The third one always humors me a little bit.
I feel like the third one should be the biggest.
I know.
Love seeing the results numbers. Thanks everybody for participating.
Yeah, for sure. All right, so that makes a lot of sense. I have one more for you here, and that is, you know, are you IT? Are you BI analytics? Oh, interesting. All right, so we mostly have people like me, BI analytics type people. All right, cool. Excellent. All right, we'll keep that window open because we'll have a few more of those come along.
We did get a good comment just saying how I think the whole paradigm shift now is there's like mix, right? We see BI analytics team actually being part of the functional business units these days. I don't know if
this is true. This is true. I'm actually working with a company right now, and we're working on putting together their center of excellence, right? And the whole idea is there are these satellite people that are going to work with the centralized team, which is, you know, basically they're doing their center of excellence. Their scope is vastly user support, but some level of governance as well, right? But those people that are all sitting in the business units are kind of like satellite members almost, and that kind of thing. So yeah, for sure. Okay, so where I want to start is just a super quick section on approaches. And so this is that diagram that I told you a moment ago that you would see, and I'm not going to go with this in depth, but what I want you to be aware of if you're fairly new to BI and maybe just trying to get your head around what exactly is Power BI. When someone says Power BI or they're talking to you about Power BI, are they talking about the service? Are they talking about desktop? Are they talking about the ecosystem as a whole? Right? So I tend to find that people that aren't familiar with it just expect it to be another reporting tool, and it ends up being so much more than that, right? So that's really the point of showing you this. And then also it kind of justifies why we have to have a lot of attention to management, governance, security, et cetera. And then here's the other kicker is that, where exactly does administration start and end? And so depending on the size of your company and how your staffing is structured, your administrator might get involved in a whole lot of these, or they might only get involved, with a couple of them here. So from an approaches standpoint, you see this, we've used it in several white papers over the years. It's in the Power BI adoption framework. And you've kind of got the top down on the right, you've got the bottom up on the left, and the blended in the middle, right? And that's usually all about who's producing the content, right? Is it all centralized on the right? Is it all decentralized on the left? And then in the middle, a lot of times that's considered the sweet spot, right? Because we can centrally deliver the data and give the report authors flexibility to do what they need. The CAT team, the Power BI CAT team, has started calling this discipline at the core and flexibility at the edge is kind of their new lingo for that center column. But the whole reason that I mention this, because we're talking administration, right? But here's the thing. You might be column 1, you might be column 3. In a bigger company of any size at all, you're probably going to have all 3 at once, all at the same time, right? Your finance team might be running very much on the left, right? Other teams might be running very much in the middle. And all that's going to affect how you administer. And so it's not this one size fits all across the whole organization. All 3 of these are probably happening, and that you'll kind of have to adjust what you're doing in order to support that. And then there's the whole idea of, am I delivering personal, team, or organizational BI, right? And that's relevant because of how fast things move. And the farther over to the right we are, the more likely that we have, formal change management and formalized, deployment pipelines and all that sort of thing, right? So where we fall on this spectrum affects what we do as an administrator. As does certain things, internally and externally, that factor into our 3 columns and that kind of thing, right? The big one these days, one of the buzzwords that everybody's using a lot now is data culture, right? But kind of your maturity level there is a real thing. It's just kind of hard to define sometimes. All right, so that was our whirlwind, kind of just thinking about how, all right, administration really can vary from either company to company or even, department to department. And so here's some of the common responsibilities. We're going to talk about some of these throughout the course of this whole talk. But the other thing to know is that there's definitely other administrators or teams involved, right? You saw that great big diagram. So of course, we're going to have other people that we have to go pester from time to time in order to help us with some different things. All right. So let's start talking about who's allowed to be a Power BI administrator. And it's a balance, right? We don't want to have too much risk and have too many people that are Power BI administrators. But we want to allow the people that need to get things done the ability to get things done. And so generally the rule of thumb is trying to assign this permission or this role to as few people as possible, right? Because it is it comes with a lot of privileges, which we will talk more about here in just a few minutes. But before we go further, just kind of curious how Power BI admin you think is handled at your company currently. Nobody's fessing up to number 3 yet. Oh, somebody did. I know there's one time I was at a customer and I saw they had like 35 Power BI admins. And I said, oh my goodness, you're making me nervous.
At that point, is anybody really an admin?
Yeah.
Really interesting numbers.
I just want to clarify, you can have a few people and still be completely out of control.
Yep. Fair point, fair point. All right, excellent. Thanks, everybody. All right, so let's start with these building blocks, right? In order to manage or administer the Power BI service, there's 2 roles that can do that, our global administrator role or the Power BI administrator role. So over in Microsoft 365 or Office 365, right? There's a whole bunch of individual roles, right? Exchange, Teams, SharePoint, etc. Power BI is one of them, okay? So these are kind of the 2 roles that we are concerned with. Now, what we've been doing all along for saying who's allowed to be a Power BI administrator is we assign people directly to the role. It's a role assignment, right? And that's fine. That's what we've been doing. Historically, we've only been able to allow individuals to be added to this admin role. So the problem has come up with, what if I also want to manage a group, right? And I've got various tenant settings where an administrator's group would make sense. We might have some reports, you know, to manage BI on BI, so to speak, right? That group would come in handy with some different alerting and that sort of thing. So what sort of happened historically is, oh, well, if I can only assign individuals to the role, but I also want to have a group, right? We end up maintaining both. So there's a new thing that just got announced in August. And what it allows us to do now is we can create our Power BI administrators group, and then we assign the role to the group, and then we allow our user assignments end up happening to the group and not to the role. And so that's a really nice thing to start, you know, unifying this kind of stuff. And so the 2 main benefits, if we think about this, are, right, we're maintaining it once. The other big one, if I go back over here, see on the far right over here, I've got a group owner. Think about a great big company that is decentralized and Power BI is not managed within the IT department. Having a group owner for that group means you don't have to go to IT anytime you need a change. And I mention this because it's really not just related to the Power BI administrators group. We're going to need a variety of different other groups to manage tenant settings as well, right? Same concept applies to all of those. So it kind of reduces the demands on, you know, your higher level administrators. So it all sounds wonderful, right? it's not for free. So it's a preview feature, it's new, so that's what you got to know. Second, it only works for cloud groups, so that means we have to create it in Azure AD right now. Syncing from Azure Directory up there doesn't work yet. Custom roles doesn't work yet, doesn't matter. We're only interested in the Power BI role right now. But by the way, this feature, you know, it's relevant for any of your built-in roles. No nesting of group memberships. You do need an Azure Active Directory premium license. And here's the worst one, at least I think, is that it doesn't work with a mail-enabled security group. All right, and the last one is important as we talk about, well, what groups probably do we need to manage Power BI? The other thing that I didn't write on this here, and let me just show you real quick what this looks like, because the thing that I didn't, if I go back to the right place, and I go to my groups, sorry. Okay, so first thing to notice, I've got a yes over here for this column that I'm showing, which is that a role assignment is allowed. So that's kind of our first clue that we're doing something interesting here with assigning a role to a group. But what I was just starting to say is that the ability to assign a role to the group is something that cannot be changed once the group is created. And that's because this is pretty powerful stuff that we're doing, right? So you're going to have to, if you wanted to try to implement this, you're going to have to create a new group and implement it from there. But what's happening is if I go to my assigned roles page here within my Power BI administrators group, right? My assigned roles, and I've got the Power BI administrator role. So, so pretty cool stuff. Now, here's the thing. You heard me say a second ago that, oh, a mail-enabled group isn't supported. And why do I think that that's a problem? Well, the first one across the top is our regular Power BI administrator group role, right? We can do all of our normal stuff with it. The second one is our mail-enabled security group, right? These are the times when I do need an email to come to me, right? How about that tenant setting? Here. How about the tenant setting for receiving email notifications? This guy right here, he has to be a mail-enabled security group. How about if I'm setting some things up with PowerShell, or you're going to see something in Cloud App Security here in a few minutes? I got to have an email group. So my trade-off right now for getting the group and role aligned with the first one is that, oh, I have a separate alerting group. So I can't nest groups. So this is my current approach. If anybody has an idea of getting around it or something clever, you know, ping me in social media or something sometime, and I'd like to hear about it for sure. Some of the other biggies that we might have are the gateway admin, the capacity admin. You might have a Power BI support. And this, of course, doesn't count for managing some of the other tenant settings, the groups that you might need to request to be permission of, you know, in order to manage those as well. So these are kind of the biggies. So before I push on with the next thing, just kind of curious if Power BI admin is inside or outside of central IT in your org. Ooh, it's a dead heat so far. Oh, mostly yes. Yeah, it seems like I'm seeing more and more where it's not. and that, of course, represents particular challenges, of course. All right, it's about 2 to 1. All right. So the other factor of this is a thing called PIM, or Privileged Identity Management. And this is all about reducing how many people are administrators. So here's kind of how this whole thing goes. You set up people that are eligible to be a Power BI administrator. So in my tenant, it's Scotty, which, used to be my cat. And Scotty is an eligible Power BI administrator. When Scotty needs to do something that requires these permissions, what he can do is he can activate that role, and optionally, you can have somebody need to approve that, or doesn't have to be approved. You can maybe just log it that it happened. Then Scotty becomes part of the role. It's time boxed for a certain amount of time, could be like 8 hours, that sort of thing, and then just automatically removed when it expires. And so the reason that this is kind of helpful, right, is that it removes the need to have a second admin account just to log in and do stuff with Power BI administration. And then it also removes the number of people that are permanently just sitting there with high level with access. And then of course you've got things like access reviews and auditing history, etc. But if I go back just a little bit here, this one right here, for the people who are going to use the same group that's aligned with the role, right? PIM isn't going to work if you do your day-to-day workspace access reporting aligned with that same group, right? So the day-to-day regular people aren't necessarily good candidates for PIM, but it might be helpful if you on occasion need to allow other people. And then what happens if I go to, say, my mail, here, I am in the Peyton's email account. Peyton's another one of my old cats. Peyton had to approve Scotty's request to activate his role. And then once she went ahead and approved that, it got approved and it went through. So anyways, just an option if in fact risk reduction is something that would be helpful in your company. So let me stop there before I shift gears to the Power BI service and just check and see, generally speaking, if there's any questions yet.
It's been mostly comments.
Okay.
We were talking about Matt had a great comment he put, just if anybody wants to kind of play around with the 30-day trial with E3 and E5 and play around with some of the admin features, he put some links there. And then, James, there was a question, the whole improvement of, will there be improvements to this whole security groups and AD? JP had a great point that this static nature of like Azure AD groups is actually an improvement. I don't know if you have anything you want to speak about just around AD groups and, security group challenges.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's always evolving and getting better. The new feature specifically that I talked about will definitely get better, right? It's just like anything that rolls out now, it's essentially, minimally viable, and we'll get more and more features as we go along. But, even with other AD stuff, it just kind of sometimes takes a while for things to get fully baked, right? We'll talk about APIs and stuff here in a few minutes, right? And we can't use a service principal to log in to our admin APIs, right? But, at some point we'll get it. So it's just always a matter of iterating and voting on user voice sometimes, right?
Vote on user voice. It matters.
That's right.
For sure.
Yeah, it does for sure. Okay, so let's talk about the Power BI service a little bit. And if we're talking about the service, right, where do we have to start? We have to start with tenant settings. And you know, the tenant settings, you know, there's a whole bunch of them, right? You know, who can create workspaces, right? Here's one that actually just came out in the last few weeks, Block Classic Workspace, you know, the sensitivity labels and export and sharing. Don't get over eager with locking down a lot of these. But anyways, there's a ton of these, and they're really important. But here's the thing with the tenant settings: there's not a reader role for Power BI administrators. So if you're not an administrator, you can't just go in and see what the setting is. And my favorite story about that is a while back, the push apps to end users functionality had come out not that long before, and my client had said, "Oh, it doesn't work. It must be a premium feature." I'm like, "No, it's not a premium feature." And the thing is that he's a BI guy in a business unit, not an administrator. He had no idea that he had to be in a group in order to have that functionality work, right? And so that's why I like to suggest document the decisions that you've made for tenant settings, and also document, hey, what group would you have to ask for and in order to get approved to be able to do this thing? Oh, hang on, I got to turn that down. Good grief, why did that just happen? Hold on.
Watch out for those lights, Melissa.
They just got a mind of their own. All right, that was fun.
If anybody wants a template for documenting that, I have all the settings all listed in Excel. I'm happy to share it with people.
Oh, that'd be awesome, Chris.
Wait. The latest version of the Planning a Power BI Enterprise Deployment white paper, I went ahead and added. They're not real heavy-handed because you know, we couldn't get too authoritative from a Microsoft perspective on recommendations, but where we could, we added in recommendations or things to consider for the different tenant settings. But anyways, there is also, when a tenant setting changes, that ends up in the activity log. It's called the updated admin feature switch operation. So after you've documented them, if you're collecting your activity log data, which we'll talk about here in just a little bit, you will know that, oh, that setting changed. And then if you want, you can set up an alert for if any changes occur. And there's a couple different ways to set up those alerts. I have a blog on my website about this actually, but the short version of the story is Cloud App Security gives the nicer functionality if in fact you're licensed to use this. What you can do, if I pop back over here and show it to you for real, what I can do is I can go down to my policies. And I have a policy, it's the third one down, called Power BI Administrative Activity. And what I've done is I've said if the app is Power BI and administrative activity equals true, which means we changed our tenant settings, send me an alert. And oh, here's my little, you know, administrator alerting mail-enabled group, right? We can do other things, right? In terms of, you know, looping into Power Automate and that sort of thing. So there's lots and lots and lots of stuff you can do with Cloud App Security. This just being one of them. So that's a good way to have a just in case thing to know when your setting changes. And so the email that you receive will look something like this, right? The thing to know is just like the activity log data itself, it's not real time, right? Yeah, 1 to 2 hours. Somebody even told me not that long ago it took them 4 to 5 hours to get the first ones to get coming, that sort of thing. So, but you're notified fairly soon. The thing to know though, if you do this, it tells you that the setting changed, and it tells you that I changed, my printing feature, it's allowed to be true, but it doesn't tell me what was it before, it only tells me what it was after. And then if I changed my security groups that are allowed to do something on a tenant setting, it doesn't tell me what group membership changed or anything like that, right? So it's really just a, hey, something changed kind of a notice. So,
quick question, Melissa.
yeah.
What role is needed to set up alerts for Power BI in like the cloud app security? Looks like Chewy tried it before, but he only has the Power BI admin role.
Yeah, I think, what did I remember looking at this for let's see. Separate licensing. Is that all I put? Good. It's one of these, right? Like you've got cloud app security plus something, or all by itself, or maybe it's bundled with a 365 security or compliance, right? So it's kind of a matter of, which bundle do you have? So I don't have a perfect answer for you.
Of course,
but you're absolutely right. It's a totally separate thing. Just like using PIM that we were talking about earlier, with that just-in-time administrator, right? That would require an Azure Active Directory Premium 2 license, right? So some of this stuff is definitely, beyond just Power BI licensing. You're right to make that a point that everybody should be aware of. Okay, so in the Power BI service, right, we know our tenant settings are important. There's a whole bunch of other pages in there. One of them is workspace management. So when we go to in the admin portal to this workspace pages, initially what we see is just metadata, right? But here's the thing is that for the V2 workspaces, the new workspace experience, any admin can go in here and change the access. What that translates to is that the admin is I consider it a very high privilege role, because for the new workspace experience, which, everything will be eventually, right? They can give access to themselves or to someone else at their discretion. Now, will that change be logged? Of course it'll be logged, but it can be done. So it's a very high privilege role for this particular reason for sure. Embed codes are another thing that need to be managed. Ideally, your embed codes are set to be either, publish to web is just turned off. And if you have any embed codes here to be managed, they are either few and far between or, very selectively allowed. And so here, you want to allow very few people to do this, right? Because it's publishing your data widely on the web. It's unsecured. If somebody tells you, oh, it's just on our intranet, it's fine, they're lying, because it really is public. And so just like some of the other stuff we talked about, there's a activity log operation where we could know that a new one got generated. And then there's the list that you could validate from time to time as well. There's also the organizational visuals page. Now, this is really interesting because there's a few elements to this here. So here we're really talking about custom visuals, right? And we're talking about, do we want to allow people to use any custom visual, just certified visuals, or a select list of them? So here's what the way I usually start out with recommending it. The tenant setting says you can only use certified visuals in the Power BI service, because certified visuals have at least been validated by Microsoft that it's not doing anything that it shouldn't be, right? I hesitate to say this, right? But it's not sending data back to its own service. The problem with that is that some services need data sent back to them, like maybe a machine learning algorithm, right? So that doesn't inherently make it bad, which is why I hesitate to say that. But it's validating some basic safety, right? To make sure that you get the same experience in desktop, there's also a group policy that you can enable to make sure that in desktop people can only use certified visuals. And that prevents people from doing a whole bunch of work in desktop only to be, irritated beyond belief that they can't publish it and use it in service. So that kind of aligns the experience between those two. And then you might say, but Melissa, I have an exception. I have this vendor, they can't get it certified for one reason or the other, but it's positively trustworthy. That's where we go register it here in organizational visuals. And the reason that you, from an administrator perspective, really want to register it here is because then everybody that uses it will get the same version, as opposed to if you ask your authors to go and manage it on their own desktops. So you can improve everybody's experience and the consistency a whole lot by managing the exceptions right here. We wrote quite a bit about this in the white paper too. And since I've mentioned it twice, Gregory, if you wouldn't mind popping a link in the chat, that'd be marvelous.
Yes.
A new page that has popped up or changed recently is called Azure Connections. And so right now, what the connections are pointing to is Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2. What that is the location for where data flows data is stored, if in fact we want to basically do a bring your own data lake kind of approach. This has gotten more flexible lately to where you can see that we've got tenant level storage, and then also at the individual workspace level, if we want to allow them to connect different storage accounts. Featured content is one of those sort of odd things that I think is unusual for an admin to have to get involved with. But it can have an effect on user experience. So here's one of those things where you're starting to kind of dip your toe into partnering with the authors a little bit. So kind of figuring out how sparingly you want to try to manage feature content, and how much you want to really restrict authors, or just leave it wide open to let people go ahead and publish what they need. From a system health perspective, there's a couple of different aspects. So there's the regular Power BI support site. That's where they post information where it's for, very extreme, broad public awareness. There's the Azure status. For us, that's mostly about Power BI embedded. Of course, there's other pieces now, right? We just said Azure Data Lake Storage Gen 2, right? Even things like cognitive services, machine learning, those have hooks into Power BI now. So, it's more and more Azure stuff for sure. But then there's also in the Microsoft 365 Admin Center, and here's a place that you might not be able to actually get to directly with only your Power BI admin permissions. But if there's an issue that was like a high priority incident, here's where they're going to put the whole write-up, here the root cause and the scope and the user impact and when it started and when it ended and if anything still needs to happen, right? So You know how a lot of SLAs from Microsoft are monetary, right? We promise you 99.9% uptime, that kind of stuff, right? When they have to prove that, and there's been an incident, they write up this kind of root cause stuff. So that there are things in here sometimes that never hit the support site because it might have only affected a certain segment of customers, that kind of thing. All right, so that moves us to the next section. Any questions that we should address at this point?
I'm not seeing any extra questions. Alex, thank you for sharing the links and also some of the support links.
Sweet. Okay. So auditing and activity monitoring is one of my favorite topics. So first, why do we care about usage monitoring, right? So critical content. Let's find out what's used most, right? What if a data refresh isn't as reliable as it should be? Or what if a report is shared from someone's My Workspace, but it's getting hundreds of views per day, right? We want to know about that critical content and make sure that it's adequately supported. Change tracking, right? We want to know not only when a content changes, but maybe security changes are happening and be able to back into what security was at a point in time. From an auditing perspective, this monitoring data or activity log data is invaluable for your compliance, your audits, your security investigations. For security, you not only want to have that usage log data, but also snapshots of security. I like to take a snapshot of my workspace security once a week. From an adoption perspective, now usage is a big part of adoption, but it's not the only part. And that's because more usage is not always positive, right? Do we want to see more downloads or more data models all the time? More reports rather than, creating smarter or more flexible reports, right? So more usage is not always the whole story. So when we talk about adoption, we like to talk about, hey, are we using the technology the way it was intended to be used? And that's much harder to track. And Gregory, that's probably a big part of your role. But trustworthiness, this is one of the biggies, right? In self-service BI. How can we trust the data? And generally, the more we're reusing data, generally speaking, the more trustworthy it is. And are we seeing data set certification? And are we seeing data set reusability? Those sorts of things. And from a licensing perspective, do we have pro licenses that just aren't being used? Or are there pro users that are only consuming content? And maybe if it was all in premium, they wouldn't need a pro license. How about finding users who have signed up for a trial, but don't have a pro license assigned yet, which means they're going to have a service interruption unless we assign a license by the time that trial expires, right? You get the picture. And how about usage patterns? Do we have a ton of subscriptions in place rather than dynamic report rendering? Do we have unmet needs, that kind of thing? From a training perspective, what if you see somebody doing a ton of sharing from My Workspace and you actually contact them and direct them to information about learning why workspaces and apps are better? Or what if you're seeing a ton of data sets published by the same author and you direct them to some information about shared data sets? All that kind of stuff. And then suspicious usage patterns, right? So, suddenly we see a ton of data exports for one user. Does that mean anything or does it not mean anything? So this data is gold. And so from a from an implementation standpoint, the thing that I'm usually implementing is something to the effect of, at the top left, we've got that gold activity log data, and then we marry it up with data from some of the other APIs, like our workspace inventories, where we get more dimensional data, right, about our reports and our workspaces and our data sets, those workspace security snapshots. We go to Graph and we get some, Azure Active Directory data about our users and our groups and our licenses. We can pull in some of our gateway information, control it all with PowerShell, land it in a data lake or a file system down at the bottom left. That's our original JSON data that is immutable. We don't touch it, that is safe. And then we start creating our light dimensional model in the database in the bottom middle center, with some snapshots in addition to the transactions that really help reporting an awful lot. Got the reports down at the bottom right that actually deliver the actual analytics. Now, on the release plan is some Azure Monitor integration. I feel like that might really affect the activity log data at the top left. We'll see, not sure, but that's not reflected in this because I don't yet know what it's going to look like. But in terms of getting our monitoring data, there's a whole bunch of different ways, and I could talk about this for a whole hour. But the couple of things that I do want to leave you with is, one is, if you're not getting this data yet, start with the activity log. There's a new-ish PowerShell module that gets it. There's an old PowerShell commandlet, and I listed at the bottom right here, the Search Unified Audit Log. Don't use that one. It has lots of flaws. Some of those flaws we can get around, some of them we can't, but just don't use it. Use the new one. These other options have their pros and their cons, but the top one, if you're going to actually extract the data and do some analytics on it, is by far the easiest way to get started. So just a few quick suggestions about that is, just kind of knowing what your normal is. So if you do want to actually, not only analyze the data routinely, but, use it to take action, what is and is not unusual for your particular environment. Accumulate that history. So I like to have that activity log going back 2 years if we can get it. And that helps you with your auditing requests too, right? And then also trending, right? Your quarter over quarter, etc. Those raw data JSON files, those are the ones that you want to keep. You don't want to parse the JSON when you pull it out, right? You want to just pull out the JSON and keep it to where it's dumb as far as what the data is containing at this point. The reason for that is that new properties are added on a regular basis. We all know how fast Power BI changes. And so the activity log alone, when we start pulling out every property, so every event has several properties, and a view report event has different properties than, say, a add a data source to a gateway event, right? So there's, all told, I don't know, 150, 200 different combinations of properties. And so there's new ones added all the time. If you parse the JSON, when you pull it out and you don't keep the original JSON, if something new comes, you don't know.
Quick question on that, Melissa. When you're loading activity logs, are you able to load specific columns, or do you just kind of get all in a single JSON dump?
So I pull it in just a JSON dump from PowerShell, write out the JSON file to, wherever the client wants to keep it, data lake, file system, I don't care. And then I use PowerShell to push it to a SQL database staging table. And at that point, at least my approach is that it's still just JSON. And then I use stored procedures to start parsing the JSON. And then, yes, I load it to columns and rows. And so the way I like to approach it is that then, because a lot of times we're dealing with BI teams and, they can get around with PowerShell, but they may not have deep, deep expertise. So if I have the PowerShell piece be as dumb as possible, right? All it does is pick up the data and move it. And all of the actual awareness of the data and any maintenance, right? If a new property should come along, is all done in the stored procedures and the tables and the views. That's easier for maintainability for most, BI teams. All right, so are you currently capturing audit data? And if you know how? All right, kind of across the board. All right. Excellent. All right, so closely related automation, right? We have two main automation ways, and not that this is the only, right? But the two main things we're usually thinking about are PowerShell and the REST APIs. And within PowerShell, there's two modules that are directly related to Power BI. One is called the Power BI Management module, and one is called the Data Gateway module. And it's the Power BI Data Gateway, right? There are also third-party and open source modules that do stuff. I'm really just focusing here on the ones that, Microsoft produces. And so when we're calling these modules, there's two scopes, right? Organization and individual. And what's cool about this is that an administrator can say, I'm going to use the organizational scope to say, pull metadata for the entire tenant. That's how I get my whole workspace inventory, right? I want a list of every report and every data set, et cetera, in the tenant, and grab a snapshot of what that looks like at the end of the week, right? But a technical user can absolutely, if they want to, use their individual scope and gather the same kind of data about their own content that they just have permissions to for themselves. So curious if you have invested in automation very much so far, and if so, what kind of things you might be doing. And since this is kind of an open text box, I'm going to keep talking, and then this will pop back up here in just a couple minutes, and we'll see if anybody shared anything interesting with us. So that Power BI Management module, that's kind of the main one, and it's got several modules within it, right? This is where you get the activity log data. You can also get it from the API, but the easier way to get it is through here. But we can also get a whole bunch of other stuff in terms of information. We can also actually do some management of APIs or of Power BI data if we want to as well through this module. The gateway module, right? Here's where we can do things like either get information about the gateways and the data sources or do some management. Here's the kicker. This one started out being only supported on PowerShell Core, which was 6, and now it's only supported on PowerShell 7 and above. So the other one, the Power BI Management module, is more flexible, but this one's very restrictive. So I've just started using PowerShell 7 for everything. Then we've got the REST APIs. So here's the thing. The REST APIs have a whole lot more options than that management module, but less stuff than in the Power BI service browser. And you can use them together. So you think of the REST APIs as your Swiss Army knife. So a lot of times what I do is I handle authentication with the management module. And then within the scope of the management module, I'll call the API. And then you kind of get the best of both worlds in terms of being able to use the Swiss Army knife, but simplify authentication. So you can do some really cool stuff. There's also a thing called the XMLA endpoint if you have premium capacity. It starts opening the door for you to be able to programmatically communicate with your Power BI tenant, right? And do things like connect up SQL Management Studio to your tenant and your data sets and that kind of stuff. So this is something that, you know, depending on how much automation and such that you want to do, might end up being a very important thing in your toolbox. The other thing that's very important is getting user machines and devices managed. So from a Power BI software standpoint, right, we've got regular Power BI desktop, we've got the desktop flavor for report server, you've got Power BI report builder, which is our paginated reports, right? It's basically SQL Server reporting services with a Power BI wrapper around it. You've got the mobile app, you've got the Windows app, but from a desktop perspective, it's really important that all of your users are on the same version. And so you've got, you know, the store, you can manage it through like an installer executable, or if your IT department's doing something, you know, like System Center or whatever. But there's other things that you might need to push to user machines. So like drivers. So for instance, maybe your ERP is on Oracle, or your data warehouse is on Oracle or HANA or something like that, right? So for anybody that's got a Power BI Pro license, you might just also be pushing the drivers for some of those common organizational systems. There's an Analyze an Excel provider. There's a couple of group policy settings that you might end up setting, or custom connectors if anybody in your organization has started using custom connectors to get to, you know, particular data sources for whatever reason. All right, so let's see what these, nope, a little Python and PowerShell. Okay, cool. No ideas and no plans. I like it, honest, cool. All right, security, let me do a quick time check and let you know where I'm at. I'm about 10 minutes behind, so not bad. Any questions we should hit while I'm pausing?
Let's see what we got. Again, it's a lot of banter, which I'm loving. And Alex is just being an absolute wealth of information, by the way. Thanks, Matt and Chris, of course. There was a question earlier. I think, Chewy, you had mentioned about the logs. Sorry, I'm just scrolling. Here's one. I think it was answered, but is it still necessary to be an O365 admin to access the Power BI audit logs?
No. So that activity log through the Power BI management module, you can authenticate using a domain account which has Power BI administrator permissions. And the reason that works is because the activity log through the management module or the API only gets you Power BI data, right? Whereas if you went through the O365 management API, you're getting everything under what they call office.general, right? Which is basically everything except, I think, Exchange and SharePoint, if I'm not mistaken. So, you know, you get gobs and gobs of data. So that's why it needed elevated permissions. So yeah, now the kicker though, what's not supported right now is, because that's considered an admin API. You can't authenticate with a service principal on an admin API right now, but you can with that domain user that has Power BI admin permissions or the role.
And another question, I don't know if you'd know this, but you know, Power BI capacity admins, if they'll ever eventually have more admin functionality specific to, I think, controlling that capacity versus just, I think, oversight.
Yeah, that one I don't have any sense for that. And in fact, the trend's almost going opposite with what was just announced this week, which we'll get to here in not very long. So yeah, hang tight on that thought. We're going to talk premium here in just a couple minutes.
And then last one, do you need to be an admin to pull the tenant data through PowerShell? Good question.
Same thing that we just talked about with you need to be a Power BI administrator to use that. Yeah, because you're asking for organizational, level data. Because it wouldn't really do you much good to say, I only want to see my data. So that, that can be helpful for some users, but for, doing it for real, right? And saying, I even want to get a list of reports that's in everyone's My Workspace, right? And I want to get the activity and the counts of what's happening in everyone's My Workspace. Now, the administrator can't get to that. They can't ever access that data, but they can see the metadata around what's happening.
Got it. I think good.
Right. So security, this is pretty fast section. I mean, it's really important, but we're not going to go very deep. So, from a security standpoint, right, the user identity is certainly critical. The way they call it is that protecting the identity is the first goal. And so basically your rule of thumb is everybody needs a license. It's either free or pro, or what's the new one called? What are they going to call it? Pro Plus, maybe? Anyway, the exceptions, of course, being when you start to embed content elsewhere, and that, authentication is not handled by Power BI. So a couple of features that are usually very, very helpful are conditional access policies. So for instance, some companies really have legitimate reasons to say you can only access Power BI from a machine that's compliant with our policy or on our network or in a certain IP range, or whatever, right? If you need to, you can do all those things. Azure Active Directory also has some interesting governance perspectives that can be helpful. So one thing is called a terms of use. And so let's say, for instance, we're in a very highly regulated industry, and maybe at the time that you're getting your Power BI Pro license, maybe we also want you to acknowledge or agree to a data privacy or a data handling policy, right? This is at least one way that we could implement that. We have access reviews. The goal with this is, can we find issues before the auditors do? So basically the idea is I want to periodically review my administrators or my sensitive groups at key points in time. And then privileged identity management, we talked about that earlier, just reducing the risk of having too many admins that have full-time access. There's also permissions managed by content authors themselves, right? So the people sprinkled throughout the org that are doing self-service BI. I have a couple of videos on this as far as just kind of talking about, hey, here are the things to be aware of. And so really at this point, there's just kind of because we don't have time to go down the rabbit hole of this whole stuff, but have training on good security practices for your authors and encourage them when they can use groups to use groups instead of users, right? That comes naturally to some of us, but that wouldn't come naturally to a lot of your self-service authors that are, responsible for managing security to the content that they publish. Now, permissions for our gateways. There's a couple different aspects to what is managed, right? At the gateway level, they manage who the other administrators are, but at the data source level, they manage any stored credentials, permissions, if SSO is used, what the data privacy level is used. So I won't go into detail of all these, but these are super important, right? In order to manage everything effectively.
Sure, gateway's a sensitive subject for a lot of people, And I don't know if you
Yeah.
ever just like, I hear, hey, we need help with a gateway, and I just shudder.
Oh, yeah. I'll talk gateways more here in just a couple minutes too. So we'll give kind of a quick rundown for anyone that has not managed gateways yet, at least kind of what the skinny is on managing them. But a often forgotten thing is, where's the source Power BI files sitting before they get published to the Power BI service, and are they in a secure place? And does those permissions align basically with who's allowed to see it in the Power BI service, or at least not more permissive? And then if we're going to talk about the source Power BI files, we got to start thinking about, how about if I've got a source Excel file or a source CSV file, right? How about then the things that we start sending out of the Power BI service, our data exports and our reports, right? So, the question is there guidance that you want to give to your user community of, hey, here's where we recommend, you store this kind of stuff? Easier said than done, I know. Then there's also, from a security standpoint, again, the use of sensitivity labels. So these are something that you would have to work with the larger Microsoft 365 administrator to get the sensitivity labels actually configured for them to be able to be used here in the Power BI service. And then there's a tenant setting that controls who can apply sensitivity labels. If for whatever reason you don't want to just rely on regular workspace security, right? You could narrow it down even further. And this is just a report that shows which labels are used across the whole tenant to give you kind of a quick idea of which ones are used. But here's the thing with sensitivity labels. They don't do a lot of good unless your users actually know what the impact is, what it means. So, for instance, if there's a label, who's allowed to do what with it, right? Not only who's allowed to access that data, but are you allowed to download it? Should you be anonymizing it? Sometimes IT policies in this area also talk about, it needs to be stored and encrypted, which is kind of a given these days. But basically just what's the expectation for people, what they are and are not allowed to do, based on the label. And that's, I usually refer to that as something like a data handling policy. Interestingly, it's sort of kind of security. Back in Cloud App Security, these are what they call threat detection policies, and I did not configure these. These are basically auto-configured, and it's using machine learning in the background to say something anomalous is happening. This is not meeting your normal pace. And so the first ones that they have introduced are, hey, there's more report sharing happening than usual, or suspicious report sharing. So these are kind of interesting. Last thing under the umbrella of security is just, hey, there's a few different encryption keys. Manage them well, stick them somewhere safe, corporate password vault if you've got one, but do what you need with your encryption keys. All right, gateways. Any questions before I dive into gateways?
Again, not seeing questions, just comments.
All right. So we have gateways in premium, and then we'll have, whatever time is left for whatever Q&A that you all have left. So each one of these sections, kind of like security, was just kind of a quick overview. These last two are quick overviews as well. So gateways, we have two kinds. We have the personal mode and we have the standard mode, the one that I still desperately want to call enterprise, and they just don't call it that anymore, even though I really want to. They're both referred to as a gateway cluster, right? That's a general term you tend to see for the data gateway cluster. And that holds true whether it's a single server gateway or not, right? So the standard mode is designed to be a true cluster, which we'll talk more about in a moment. But the standard mode here on the left, right, it's really designed to be administered by the gateway admin. And as opposed to the personal mode where that's designed to just run on somebody's laptop. My hope is always that we can use standard mode as much as possible and at least minimize the use of personal mode to the extent possible, and at least not have it be completely out of control. If you're using direct query or live connections to something like, analysis services or something, you kind of have to do those through your standard mode because they're not supported on the personal mode. But kind of what's happening here, right, is at the bottom, we've got our data sources that Power BI has to be able to find somehow. And so it reaches into those through the gateway and then communicates up with any number of these different services. And so when you've registered a gateway in standard mode, not personal, all of these different services can share the connectivity and basically share the gateway access to the data source. What they don't really share, though, is the data source connection detail. I hope that all sort of solidifies over time. But right now it's, yeah, go ahead.
Sorry, great question that came through. Is there a way to disable personal mode for non-admins?
Oh, I love the question. Hold that thought for just a minute. Yeah.
Happy, great question.
Yeah, and the answer is yes. So, but let me get to it in just a moment. So when do we need a gateway, right? When we're refreshing imports, data flows, those refreshes, direct query, live connection, right? And our data is either on premises, meaning behind our corporate firewall, or sitting in like cloud-based IaaS. So I should rephrase this, a virtual machine, right? That's basically kind of like sitting in your data center. Or if you're even using PaaS, like Azure SQL Database, but you've added it to a virtual network, or you're using private links and all that kind of stuff, right? That's all acting just like it's on-prem, right? So I mention this because sometimes people say, oh, if it's in the cloud, you don't need a gateway. And that's not true, because virtual networks and that kind of stuff is getting more and more and more popular. And then there's an or. There's some other weird M functionality that kind of just ends up needing a gateway in order to make it work. Chris Webb told me about these, so I can't elaborate on them beyond the fact that there's a few functionality things there. From a management perspective, we've got a thing called the Power Platform Admin Center. We've got gateway management and service. You've got things that you do actually on the gateway server where it was installed. All three of those have their own GUIs, right? And then you've got some stuff you can do by PowerShell. So I'm not going to go through, all these details. It's just a matter of telling you that there are, various places to do things. I think we're going to see more and more come to the Power Platform Admin Center, which is very integrated with Power Apps and all that kind of stuff. So, to the question that was just asked a minute ago, who can install gateways? If we go to, here in the Power Platform Admin Center, Manage Gateway Installers, and then you basically turn on this thing right here that restricts users in your org from installing gateways. So that's going to basically restrict both the standard and the personal. And so that will set it up. And unless it's changed, I really hope it has. but it didn't used to accept groups. I hope that that's been fixed. So you've basically got two things that you can do in PowerShell 2. You've got the gateway installer, and then you've got the data gateway tenant policy, which, looking at my notes over here, there's a personal gateway install policy, and there's a resource gateway install policy. So you kind of basically have those two policies used in conjunction with who can install gateways that then kind of carves it up to get it done how you need to get it done. So question, do you allow personal gateways where you're at? I've got a customer right now that when they're in their initial training, what they do is they try to avoid the need for using gateways, right? Because you might have to register a data source, you might have to register a user. It introduces friction that they want to eliminate in training. And so the concern there is that what you teach people to do in training is what they may continue to do, right? So we're kind of working through some of that. Okay. Okay. So in your production gateway cluster, I recommend that that really is a true cluster and you have at least two machines, right? You don't want a single point of failure, especially if you've got a lot of users and it's, you know, an important access point to get, you know, refreshes or direct query and stuff done. It also, you know how the gateway software, it updates once a month. That allows you to install software on one gateway cluster while the other one's still up and running and accepting any, you know, direct queries or import refreshes. You can rotate them and you don't have downtime. And then, of course, it'll do some load balancing as well. Dev test, you know, if you don't need a true cluster and you can get by with just one to do a quick test of monthly updates, make sure all is well, that's fine with me. If it's fine with you that dev test doesn't match production. From a server specs perspective, the thing to know is that it does do more than just connectivity, right? Depending on how much query folding can happen and that sort of thing, right? There's actually work that happens on the gateway cluster machine in order to transform and merge data, et cetera, et cetera. So the rule of thumb is that CPU is more important for direct query and live connection. Memory's always important in Power BI, right? But it tends to be more important for your data refresh operations. And then of course, bandwidth is always important. So, you know, scaling up your cluster might be suitable sometimes, or scaling out, you know, adding another machine or two to that production cluster may be suitable sometimes as well. So at this point, do you have at least two machines in your production gateway cluster?
A lot of people are answering that. How about some questions, or do you want me to hold on?
Yeah, go for it.
Okay, so I see Sebastian, you were saying when giving access to external users through Azure AD B2B to Power BI reports, and the reports using the gateway to on-prem analysis services, but no sync to on-prem AD, how do you set access to an on-prem SSAS to an external user? I don't know if you followed all that.
Yeah, that's a little beyond me. Besides knowing that it has to be based on effective username, that's a little bit beyond what my brain can spit out anything helpful for at the moment.
And then another great question from Kathy. Is there a way to find which reports are pointing to a particular gateway data source or remove a data source from a gateway?
Yes. So the APIs can help you connect up all of the data. And then in terms of removing a data source from a gateway, you could do that through the APIs. You could also do that through Oh, I didn't start my VM that's running my gateway. But you could also do that. So in this tenant, the enterprise DW is the data source that's registered to the data gateway prod. And so, yeah, how I would do that, it's super funny in the UI. When I hover on it, there's these 3 ellipses that pop up that you barely see, and you click on that and you remove if you don't want to use the API. It's not very obvious because even if I click all the way over here to the left, I don't see them. You gotta go all the way over here and make those ellipses show up.
You know the hacks, Melissa.
Okay, so set up right, just like your user machines. If you're setting up custom drivers or custom connectors on your user machines, the gateway machine's going to use it as well. And the gateway software is updated every month. You don't necessarily have to stay up to date every single month, but you want to stay relatively current, right? Because it's running a mashup engine, just like Power BI Desktop does, just like the service does. You want everything to stay fairly close in sync. All right, last couple concepts on this to share is that the gateway cluster itself has administrators that you manage. There's individual data sources registered to each gateway cluster. And here we're talking standard. And then there's users for each data source. And so this is all really important from an administration perspective because you've got an author, they publish something up to the service, it fails, right? It could be that the data source isn't registered. It could be that they're not on the user list for permissions to be able to just connect up to that data source. And so there's a silly little warning when in your data set, when you're choosing the gateway, it says, oh, you don't have a personal gateway. It's like, even if you're connecting to a standard one just fine. So it tricks people into using the personal or installing it when they don't need it. So anyways, all of this is to say that you need to have a really good support process that responds to this stuff really fast, right? You need a new data source, you need a new user permission, that sort of thing. And then to make things confusing, the Power BI service calls the gateway cluster administrators, properly calls them administrators. The Power Platform Admin Center calls them users, but they're really administrators at the cluster level, not users at the data source level. So heads up there. All right, last FYI is on your gateway server, you can enable these 4 log files. And a few months ago, we did some testing to make sure they do not seem to affect performance. You get tons of really nice information from this. You can start integrating it, in with some of your other activity data and that kind of stuff to build out more analytics if you want. But this is the place where you're going to start finding out, oh, I'm going to have to scale up or out my cluster because I'm using, a lot of resources between, 4 a.m. and 7 a.m. or whatever, right? Start either scale up or start spreading out activity more if you can, that sort of thing. So these have some really good information on them.
Quick
okay,
question.
So last section. Yeah, what you got?
Yes. Would you recommend letting business users manage a gateway cluster? For instance, like maybe giving a certain domain access to their own gateway.
Yeah, so that is kind of a tricky one because the answer could be yes if they're expected to go ahead and manage new data sources or the users, and that's where I think the question probably comes from. So then the question is, over on the gateway server itself, are they also responsible for the monthly updates of the software? And that's where then sometimes it becomes a partnership with IT, right? Even if one team manages the gateway software, maybe IT is still going to manage, Windows updates and that kind of stuff. So I think it's just a matter of, where does that separation of duties end? But, I don't see why not, if it takes the load off and, they're trustworthy to get it done. Sure.
Yeah, I've done that. I've given it out to a division that's responsible for a particular data center and let them self-manage it. And
Yep.
it's self-inflicted injuries. If they don't update it, their users who they support suffer. So as long as you have a good, healthy situation like that, it can work fine.
Yeah, cool. All right, we're almost in the home stretch. Premium capacity. So first question, are you using premium now? Ooh, now I am officially running late. Sorry
You
about
run as
that,
late as you like,
everybody.
Melissa. Don't you worry.
Okay,
As long as you don't
thanks.
fall asleep on us.
Now I'm wired.
Now you're awake. All right.
I drank a cup of tea though, right before we started, so I got some evening, a little bit of caffeine. All right, so pretty much across the board. Okay. So why do we use premium? So just, quick, right? The whole, I want to use a free license for the read-only users, right? Usually it's most cost effective. When you get past about 500 users is roughly the breaking point, at least retail pricing. You got scalability, right? Large data sets, et cetera. This, kind of marketing-ish sounding, right? Unifying enterprise BI and self-service BI, right? We start getting features, more features like our deployment pipelines, and we get more features for data flows and, change detection with our automatic page refresh, all that kind of stuff. We get some compliance features. If we say, hey, I'm in this particular geography, I need to make sure that the data stays in that geography and my main Power BI tenant may not be there. We can put a premium capacity over in another area. Premium's how we start doing some of the more fancy stuff, integration with Azure, and then the idea of a hybrid cloud. They give you Power BI Report Server if you buy premium. So if you're using premium, I'm curious kind of what pushed you over the edge to buy premium, right? Some people say paginated reports. Some people say some other features, particularly the free users. This is one that we'll come back to here in just a couple minutes. Okay, so I didn't have time to redo this today. So there are currently two types of capacity, but there's a new one on the way. So let's kind of have a little bit of a current and futures conversation. Power BI Premium, right, is the thing that we buy to get all those features that we just talked about, and it's priced by the month. And if you hear P1 or P2, those are our P series SKUs. And then there's the rarely used EM SKUs. Then you've got the notion of Power BI embedded. And those are our A series SKUs. We buy them in Azure and we pay by the hour. Those are designed to scale up and down and pause, right? Whereas Power BI Premium per se, the one on the left, is really just meant to, be slow and steady, up 24/7, and you're not scaling from a P1 to a P2 and back again, right? Then there's the new thing, premium per user, that has been announced this week, and it's going to go into public preview in November. So I'm trying to decide where I want to dive in. So let me elaborate on the premium per user in just a second, because I think that it will make more sense in like one or two slides. So the thing that I want you to know about Power BI Embedded is that because we can pause it and that kind of stuff, it's a great way if you want to just try out premium features and see how they work, and then just pause it when you're not using it. That's exactly how I run my demo environment. I say it's a lower cost alternative, but only when we don't need it 24/7. If you run it 24/7, you do end up paying more than you would pay for like an A4 is equivalent to a P1. You would pay more over the course of the month for the A4 than the P1, right? And maybe that flexibility is worth that to you. Maybe it's not. Okay, so when you buy a premium capacity, right? At least with the current flavor of it today, right? Let's say I bought a P3 and it's 32 virtual cores or vCores. When I set it up in Power BI, I can set it up and I can divide up those cores differently than how I purchased them. And then we have the notion of assigning workspaces to a capacity. And then that's what unlocks features, is because the workspace has been added to a capacity. And then within the capacity itself, there's all these knobs that we have for how the capacity is managed. Now, whereas there's been this huge trade-off and analysis of, do I divide up that 32 vCores into more than one? And we would be tempted to do that if we need to, say, isolate some workloads. If we need, say, the finance department to have their own capacity, right? They want to administer it. If they overload it, it's their problem, right? That's a very real need. And that's one reason why we carve them up differently. But there's trade-offs, right? When we have the single larger capacity, our specs get bigger. We can have, larger model sizes, more parallelism, et cetera, et cetera. So if I go back to this one for a second, premium capacity to date has been this thing that you have to manage. You have to monitor it and figure out, am I using it effectively? And then the price point, the entry point is high, right? Retail is $5,000 per month, which for small and medium businesses has been too high of an entry point. So that's all to say, this new thing that they announced this week, which is premium per user, is all about saying, instead of you purchasing X number of vCores and being responsible to manage it, if you have the premium per user license, you can use all of those features. Now, the kicker will be that, let's say Workspace A has content published to it by Sally, who has a PPU license. Everybody that reads that content, or that she distributes and shares it with, is also going to need a PPU license, right? So I think where we're driving to is a scenario where some big organizations still might have needs to have a proper premium capacity, right? They might still need some of the compliance needs. They might still want to do some management themselves of this, whereas the PPU, you don't have any of this. None of this, or very little, is exposed. It's all managed by Microsoft. And it's much more like, hey, now when you publish content and you set it up like using your Pro license, and you set it up to be a refresh, and it just runs on shared capacity, and it's Microsoft's problem to balance that. That's going to be the same as true for PPU, which is going to be very, very attractive for particularly small and medium companies. So it'll be interesting to see what kind of mix we have of proper premium, or whatever it's going to be called, right, with PPU. And the last thing I'll say on this is that because PPU is not going to be on dedicated capacity, it's going to be on shared capacity. That means I think we also have to stop calling just saying any dedicated capacity is the same as premium, because that's not going to be true anymore. I would imagine that there's a couple of comments about this. And this is just about monitoring health. But yeah, any comments about the announcements or additions about PPU that I didn't say?
Man, we have quite the discussion points in the chat between AAS, premium, A SKUs, P SKUs. Oh man, Melissa.
It gets so confusing. It really does. And I tried in the white paper, we rewrote one section. I think it's towards the end of section 3, which is just kind of a, hey, here's our different options. When might we use which one? Because it gets so confusing. And then you start getting into things like app owns data and user owns data, which I think are not intuitive terms. So yeah, and that's the embedding side of things. And let me actually clarify. A lot of times people talk about embedding in conjunction with Premium or Power BI Embedded because of the idea of the free users, but you don't have to have capacity in order to do embedding, but a lot of times they're talked about together. So it gets so confusing. So if you decide to go down the road, just make sure that you allocate some time to, go down the rabbit hole and
We're going
learn.
down the rabbit hole in chat. I'll tell you that much. Lots
Okay,
of documentation stuff.
I'll have fun reading the chat tomorrow then. Okay, cool. All right, so let me wrap this up with my final thoughts to share, and then we'll see what else might be on anybody's mind. So if you're just getting started administering or overseeing Power BI, start getting that activity log data. And just as a reminder, don't parse it immediately, just capture the raw data so you have that history. Review your tenant settings, validate them, document them. Check who has been granted the Power BI administrator role in Microsoft 365. Hopefully it's a minimum number of people. Of course, you won't have any control over who's your global administrators. Hopefully that's not a ton of people either, but kind of just verify that. And then if your gateway server is a single node and it's an important piece of your overall architecture, address that just so you don't have a single point of failure that could cause a disruption to users. All right, so you might say, yep, I got all that, Melissa. What's next? So next, analytical reporting for your activity log data, right? There's so many things that we can do with it, that we can start being not just reporting on it and being reactive, but we can be proactive about adoption and training and all that stuff. And then augment that data with other stuff that will inherently make it more valuable and useful. Review your workspace and your apps that are in use, including naming conventions. That kind of comes back down to in your tenant settings, who's allowed to create workspaces? Is it everybody? Is it a smaller group of people? Is there some improvements or cleanup that can be done just that will help the user experience? And how about an end-to-end security review, right? This kind of, you got to get some of the data out of the system first, but do you know where your risk spots are? All right, let's say you've gotten pretty mature. What's next? So, really look for certain circumstances with that activity log data and the API data where you can take action and be proactive. Think about working with your governance teams on, improving trustworthiness and consistency, right? Shared and certified data sets. And as an administrator, you may or may not want to really start getting into how the data is used, but a lot of us wear a lot of different hats. So assuming that you're one of those people. And then maybe your data classifications and the data handling policies. And then when you do have data handling policies, how do you make sure that not only, can you manage them, can you audit them? So the last few slides in here, if you go download them, have some links here, like the release plan is absolutely gold somebody, if you're not familiar with the release plan and the URL, say so in the chat and we'll pull it up for you. Obviously, the Power BI blog is huge. They've actually just announced that they are consolidating the desktop service and I think gateway into like one set of releases and one announcement. So it's more of a cohesive view when announcements come out every month. And I think that's great. And then just kind of a reminder, right? We've got a vibrant community. Oh my gosh, it's wonderful, right? But that person that wrote that blog 4 months ago, it might not be right anymore. So just be really careful with info online. Administrative decisions, right? Be really careful with making decisions on the fly because you do have a lot of power. And, you know, what we want to do is help people get things done and just not be overly controlling and restrictive and that kind of stuff. And don't be afraid to do a lot of technical POCs to verify that we understand what's happening. That's kind of the way of the world now, is that things are moving too fast. And I think doing a technical POC to prove things out and not assume that, oh, just because this feature came out, it's going to do everything that we need. Okay, so Q&A time. Just to kind of let you know, here's all the URLs that you might need. I've also got way at the very end a variety of different URLs from just stuff I talked about during the course of the presentation. So I'll leave this up for a second, and I just talked for a really long time.
Take a deep breath.
Went over time. So so thanks for sticking in there. What kind of questions do you still have brewing?
So before we get to questions, honestly, I want everybody either go off mute, share your video, do whatever. There's been so many GIFs in the chat. Let's really thank Melissa for the time and just how densely packed this session was.
So good, so good.
Great
Thank you so much,
job.
Melissa.
Thank
Great
you.
job. Excellent.
Thank you.
So good.
Seriously, Melissa, thanks again just for everything. I've been able to kind of drop some links as we've going. Let me just kind of scroll through with questions. And let's get this, let's open up the floor. I think I see a question from Kathy. I converted workspaces from V1 to V2. Users other than owner permissions rolled into one line with workspace name and viewer permissions. Can't see who has permissions or not. Any way to fix this?
Yeah, so the kind of the downside now to the whole when you flip it, right? And so now the new workspace experience has these 4 levels, right? The old workspace experience only had, hey, what's the one Office 365 group? So when it maps over it, it doesn't know what to do with it. And so what you need to do is figure out, can everybody in that Office 365 group just be, say, a contributor? And you can see here, now this is a demo environment and easier said than done, right? But you can see that I've got these AAD groups set up to say, hey, I've got a group that's aligned with these 4 levels. Out in the wild, that's not always an easy thing to implement, right? But it's, you know, it's at least an idea that I share with people as an option. So I don't have a great answer for your question, right? Because you know, you can find the members, you know, either over in Microsoft 365 or pull in the APIs, and then the question is, do you have to start divvying them up here, either by creating other groups or just by individuals? And so, yeah, the conversion process is not, you know, super easy and straightforward always. Got
it. Good question. Here's an interesting people question, and I'm actually really intrigued to hear what you say, Melissa. Melissa, how do you encourage traditional IT administration to actually listen and meet the needs of their Power BI users? And I know you laugh, but, you know, sometimes, at least for me, it's, you know, Power BI is new, even for the IT administrator, right? How do you get them to open their ears up, or, you know, what are some of your selling points?
I know. So I think I always remember back to, my gosh, this was probably 10 years ago, and I'm sitting next to a client, we're sitting in a cube, right, working on a project, and suddenly he just goes off and he says, I just want to take away cube access from all of these people. They don't know what they're doing. And, and he's complaining about them sending terrible queries, and blah, blah, blah. So I said to them, well, what kind of resources do you have for them? And, he admits to me that, they get their couple-hour training session and then they are off on their merry way to figure it out. And so I think it so comes down to how supported are the users in the organization. And granted, I know not everybody is going to watch the short videos or read the documentation or really use the support, but I feel like the more that you educate and invest in your internal user community, the more the administrators can hopefully start saying, okay, we have to have guardrails, and sometimes it's compliance reasons, sometimes it's an overzealous administrator, but we got to have guardrails, but we can start to scale them back the more we invest and teach people really what to do. But I don't know, if anybody else has a better answer than that, go for it, because it's a hard question.
For sure. Another good question and interesting, Ray's asking, will Azure Data Catalog ever factor into the admin experience? And this is something I've been wondering. I mean, I wish Microsoft would pour more into the Azure Data Catalog. What I've seen is some of the partnerships, I think it's with Informatica, and talking to the product team saying, yeah, Azure Data Catalog's like not a place we can go. And Alex Powers, please feel free to chime in. Yeah, Melissa, thoughts?
Coming soon. I would continue to watch.
Yeah, stay tuned.
That's all I got.
Yeah, I
Please
can't
tell me I'm
share
wrong.
any details, even though I have kind of an abundance of details. Yeah.
I would just say be very patient. The P in Power BI stands for patience.
I've been so patient. We are being
Yeah, I mean, it's a huge gaping hole, the fact that, we don't have a nice yeah, let me just stop.
Yeah. Don't say anything more.
Stay tuned.
You told us enough. Let's see. I'm going through, looking through.
Alex, didn't you attend this same session before?
I would attend every session you have, Melissa. They're also wonderful.
You have a following, Melissa. As long as I don't know if you want to believe it or not, but you do. Third. What is that third owner column on Melissa's screen? Is it still the same when I share reports between workspaces?
I share reports through Workspaces. So the third owner column that you're looking at right here, this is just the name of the workspace, right? As opposed to, like, if I was in my workspace, it would be me. But most of these reports relate over to data that's in my sales data workspace, because I'm very big on the idea of separating the data from the reports. And I've got a video on that as well. If you're kind of wondering why would we bother, there's a few really good reasons why. But yeah, this is just the workspace name.
Got it. And we're getting a bunch of thank yous, of course, Melissa. If anybody wants to jump off mute, whether it's a question or comment, don't feel like you have to type it in. It is getting late for Melissa, so I do want to kind of put a guardrail on it. Any other questions before we transition?
I'll ask a question if you don't mind.
Alex, we so mind.
Oh, well, thank you. So Melissa, just data modelers, all these people. So it's really hard to kind of have these multiple administrative roles. Is there ever a person that's out there kind of fine tuning like on the premium capacity side to manage the models, what's coming in, looking at Power Query M. Does that role exist? Do you traditionally see, or is it, how does it look?
Yeah, so I know there's one company that I'm working with right now. What we're talking about is the process for getting a data set certified. And that includes making sure that the model is optimized and that sort of thing. So it's not exactly what you answered, right? But it's, it's a gate to say, to make sure, and if it's certified, presumably we're using it more, not necessarily, right? But theoretically, than some others. So, the other thing I've heard of is like if the Center of Excellence has, basically they can serve as internal consultants for others in the organization. So that would rely on, say, Sally down in finance saying, I know my model is suboptimal and I need some help, fine tuning it or whatever, and kind of getting that level of help. So yeah, I think it can exist in different forms. So if anybody else has seen it, please pipe up, because
I see Chewy's got his
to
hands
hear
up. Chewy?
Yes, one question. The administration of Power BI, will you see that duty or function as part of a group that is leading the adoption and leadership of Power BI in one organization, or do you see it as some companies do? Actually, I think where I work for, I think they see it like that, like, oh no, the administration team is just like you're doing the administration for any other system, but you are not supposed to lead the adoption of the platform. How do you see that?
Yeah, in BI, let's break some rules, right? The best kind of administrator is the one that is close enough to at least have some level of understanding of how people are using the system, right? Because then they can make better decisions, right? Mm-hmm. Think about all these things that you cannot make good decisions about unless you know what people are really doing, right? And so I think we need to have IT involved for sure. Mm-hmm. But preferably the folks that are involved with this are purple people, right? They're not purely IT, they're not purely business, right? They straddle both worlds and have a foot in both kind of a thing. So I do know that my couple of recent clients that have had where all of the administration and all of the responsibility for deploying Power BI to the organization happens in a department that is not IT. They do struggle with certain things. It's almost like they're the power users in some respects, right? There's all these parallels of what IT lets them do and then what they let other people do, right? And so anyways, but yeah, I think if it's not at least a purely IT thing, your success rate will go up.
Combination, I guess.
Great question.
Yeah, just from my experience, just to answer that, Chu, because I've been through that. I think the Power BI admin can be, like sort of a cloud admin and just technical, but if they do that, they really have to be very transparent with like all the settings and all the like tenant configuration and like publish that information out, so all those other teams that don't have that permission can understand why certain things are not working. And there's a massive amount of education of like Center of Excellence teams and a lot of dialogue, I think, to make their apps and the things they're publishing out across an organization successful, because it's really confusing, like to understand a lot of the concepts. So I think it's hard to divorce the Power BI administration from the the spreading of that viral pattern if you really want to get it out there, because they just get stuck. They need someone to answer a lot of those very complicated questions, and you can't have that distributed. You have to kind of like have a few people who really figure it all out, and then those people can go do as like an escalation to get answers to questions that otherwise they go in circles on. So I think it needs to be paired together from the standpoint of education and getting obstacles out of the way. But if you really want to have someone just technical, they can do that, but they need to be really transparent. That's my take.
Right. Thank you.
Drop knowledge. All right. Well, with that, Melissa, I think we can wrap this thing up.
All right. Well, you were right. You have a great group. This was super fun.
We're so blessed for everybody that's always such active participants and everybody who shows up. I mean, truly, we all love to play off each other. So thanks everybody that joined. Thank you, Melissa. For those that want to stick around for Jeff's session on Analyze and Power BI, let's stick around. But again, let's just give another round of applause for Melissa. Thank you so much. We hope to have you back again.